we've seen estimates that if there's 10,000 data centers in the world right now, the world actually needs 30,000. Do you think that's in the right ballpark given expected demand?
Let's dive into your last two words of that question, which are expected demand. People are very bullish on the demand for AI. What I'm waiting to see is who spends a lot of money on technology? It's large businesses. Where do large businesses really start deploying and leaning into AI? I think they're just beginning to have those conversations. I think we'll be going on a multi-year journey. Yes, we're going to need 2 to 3 times the amount of data centers we have. To me, the question is over what time scale?
Hello and welcome to Cool Vector. I'm David Snow, your host. And today we're joined by John Siegel of Columbia Capital. Columbia Capital is a specialist in digital infrastructure and data centers, as well as enterprise technology and mobility. John Siegel, thanks so much for joining Cool Vector today. Thanks for being here.
Very happy to be here, David.
All right, well, we've got a lot to learn from you because you have been in and around the digital infrastructure space for quite a long time in the telecommunications business. You spent a lot of time in Northern Virginia, which is a hub for Telecom, and we're going to learn why. Maybe we can just talk about your experience in digital infrastructure for quite a long time. You've been involved in a lot of different companies, and of course, every company is different, but if you could find sort of a common macro theme that ties them all together, what do you think that theme would be?
So what I would say is if you look over the past 35 years, you've seen this entire space move from one that was entirely focused on services. So providing services to end users, people would invest in their infrastructure and then actually use the infrastructure to provide services. Think about your classic phone line, your cellular service, et cetera. What you have seen as the internet has become a utility, companies and individuals' relationships with that infrastructure has changed. And so it has gone from being a service much more to underlying infrastructure that people or really large enterprises buy on a long-term basis rather than short-term contracts. And then that shift to you really kind of utility points to the industrial strength and frankly, the size and scope of what we now call the internet, which was really a telecommunications network and telecommunications infrastructure 35 years ago. It is now something much different, but it really hasn't changed that much to the end user.
I'm glad you mentioned the word infrastructure. Where does the sort of infrastructure end and where does the operating business and the services begin?
It really depends on the asset class. I would say there are 3 primary classes of digital infrastructure, and then there may be some subsectors underneath it. The first would be data center infrastructure. The second would be networks, fiber networks primarily. And the third would be wireless infrastructure. Think wireless towers, DAS systems. So where the lines go from raw infrastructure, if you think about someone who is building and providing data center capacity, people in the data center space would contract if on the infrastructure level, would build a building, power it, and contract that with a very large end user who would take down a substantial portion of the building or the entire building. Think about it much as a real estate model. The same thing on the wireless side, where people would build real estate, i.e. a tower, and then lease space on that tower to a wireless carrier. Again, very much like a real estate type relationship. Then if you move towards fiber networks, which the shades of gray are probably a lot more subtle, you can start with just a raw infrastructure model. You build the infrastructure and you either sell it or lease just the infrastructure. And it's, again, kind of a classic real estate type relationship to a large hyperscaler, a large carrier, or you would even sell them the infrastructure, sell them the fiber networks, all the way till you are someone like Verizon and you are selling someone a phone service. So you pay for that service on a monthly basis. And you can switch and go to another provider if you would like. The fundamental relationship in terms of contract, the ease to break that contract, CapEx required for it, totally different between the infrastructure side to the services side. And again, in those classes of infrastructure, wireless really was kind of the original gangster on digital infrastructure. Next really comes the data centers, and there are infrastructure models. There are also models that are retail co-location where you can own a data center and lease that space out much more on a services basis. And then when you get all the way to the network side, things get a lot grayer.
Interesting. Well, as you are aware more than anyone else, we are in the midst of a huge build out of physical infrastructure for the internet. AI is driving a lot of that, or at least the expectation of how AI is going to be used, and we're going to talk about that. You must have to really understand the physical assets that make the digital world work. Let's talk about one and very important connecting asset. That would be fiber optic cables. What are some attributes and challenges of fiber optic cables that you think investors would be surprised to learn about?
So and again, I've talked to people about fiber optic cables till they walk away. If you think again to the dawn of the internet, the largest fiber optic cable that people would buy or provision was 864 fibers. So 860 fiber cores. That was a single cable, and you would basically roll that out and then attach lasers to the end and shoot basically beams of light and enable each one of those effectively kind of strands of glass, which are not much larger than a human hair. The flashing of the laser basically is how the data is transmitted. 864 count fiber, when it was put in the ground, people thought there was no way people would ever use that side cable ever again. Like you put that in the ground and that would last you for the better part of 30, 40 years, or basically till the glass degraded. If you look now, when people are putting in infrastructure, so again, cables that are powering AI, cloud instances, really kind of the guts and the plumbing of the internet, people are putting fiber optic cables that have north of 6,900 strands. So what has effectively happened is they have gone away from effectively lasers, dense wave diffusion multiplexing. So that is actually you're using different colors of light over a piece of glass. That's how you transmit data. And that gear can be very expensive. People have just shifted away from that model. When I say people, really the large hyperscalers have shifted towards just burning fiber. It's cheaper to put in the ground once the trench is open, and the optronics on it are a lot more reliable and a lot cheaper. And so you've seen this massive oversizing of cables. And as you see cloud instances and AI data centers come to play, people are chewing through those cables at a very quick rate. So rather than blue, yellow, red, green, all are transmitting different types of data or a different wavelength of data. Those are called waves. The gear that enables that is really expensive versus a simple laser that is just used to send light down across just a piece of glass. And so what people have figured out, especially in dense areas, it's a lot cheaper to put kind of a low-cost laser and use multiple pieces of fiber versus put a very, very expensive laser and use multiple wavelengths of light on that. And so that is called burning fiber.
Do these less expensive forms of fiber optic, they simply last not as long, right? Do they have shorter lifespans? You might have to go back and replace them earlier?
You can replace them earlier. They're easier to upgrade. There's less maintenance and contracts associated with it, especially in areas where there's a lot of density and you're not running extreme lengths of, probably greater than 60 kilometers. The large hyperscalers would rather burn glass than use those optronics because the optronics are really expensive and they use a lot more power, need their own footprint. There are a lot of reasons around that.
Was there an underestimation of how much data would be exchanged in the world or transmitted in the world? Was it a failure of human imagination to think about the amount of information that we would be sharing with each other?
I wouldn't call it a failure. I think what's happened is as people put infrastructure in place, they found different ways to use it. So when the original kind of what was called like the high capacity fiber networks were put in place for the internet, no one foresaw this conversation happening, which was video chews up bandwidth. And so you think about, during the pandemic, the amount of bandwidth that was consumed in a very short period of time. People just couldn't imagine the world would go completely remote and then rely on video communications. So, for example, I'm familiar of one company that spun up a network. I believe it was in Europe 3 weeks after the pandemic lockdown happened. And they basically deployed a network that was larger than the entire internet in Europe as of 2008. And that was just for one company to support video. So then if you kind of roll the camera forward, is it a failure of the human imagination for how we're using this network or, undersizing it? You could say it is, but if you think of the amount of devices that are now connected in your house, kind of the average connected house in the United States has over 38 devices connected and pulling data over networks. That data is all being transmitted to somewhere, stored somewhere, analyzed, and then coming either back to the consumer who's using it. For example, think of when you hop on your Peloton and you ride, you're getting video coming down, you're sending a huge amount of data back. That data is being stored and analyzed, and that's just one device in your house. And so I do not think in 2000 we had any idea how we would be using the internet in terms of the connectivity. But what I will tell you is we have become a lot smarter over the past, decade in terms of connected devices. And frankly, this drives the whole cloud and AI craze of how much data is being collected and transmitted back and forth between just simple sensors and how we use that.
Well, let's dwell on fiber optics just a little bit longer before we get to some other topics. Along with everything else, the world is going to need a lot of fiber optic cable as all of these data centers around the world get built out. What physical assets are going to become in high demand or are already in high demand as fiber optic cables proliferate around the world?
In terms of physical assets, let's break it into terrestrial and then kind of ocean going. So on a terrestrial basis, since the pandemic, you've seen an explosion of fiber connectivity to homes, both North America, Europe, really globally. And the type of gear that you need for that, if you're going underground, would be similar to what actually people use for fracking. It's kind of, it's hydraulic directional drills, HDD. So that's underground drilling that would basically put stuff underground so it doesn't get messed up by ice storms, hurricanes, etc. Those drills, and if you're thinking about rolling out fiber across the United States, there will be some mix of aerial, i.e. hanging off poles, and stuff that is buried underground. Those HDD machines are expensive and will be certainly in demand. The different types of cables that are made, and each one is going to have its own specification depending on the use case, is clearly an opportunity. When you flip to really kind of the oceanic cables, what you will see is the boats to deploy that. You're going to need more boats because there are going to be a lot more cables that are getting deployed, and then boats that maintain that as well. Again, these are small, niche little industries, but once a cable is laid and something happens to it at the bottom of the ocean, you need to have a specialized boat that will go grab that cable, pull it up, and then splice it. Again, with what is required to deploy these networks, you heard the term splicing. That's where you connect two pieces of glass to basically prolong that connection. Those are lasers that are used to actually melt that glass, melt and test that the signal is able to propagate across it. That is specific gear for splicing. That is called splicing. And there will be a lot of splicing going on, especially if you think about the cables that are in the ground. Someone hits it with a backhoe. The only way that that cable will be functional again is if you pull it back up and splice it.
There's going to be a lot of splicing going on. Talk briefly about the natural resources necessary to make silicon fiber cables, silica sand, I guess. I mean, is there enough of that resource in the world? Is there going to be a battle for who controls it? And
I think we're miles and miles and miles away from the lithium wars with silica. I think the silicon is going to be fine. The silica is going to be fine. Really, these are very simple pieces of infrastructure. It's glass, and then it's wrapped in plastic, effectively. You got plenty of the materials for both of those, so that you will not see a shortage of fiber optic cable, as it were, based on supplies. Different story for chips, different story for batteries.
All right, so I'm not going to invest in a silica sand REIT, according to your recommendation.
I would think there are probably better ways to spend your money.
You are based in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is a massive hub for telecom assets, in particular data centers. Why is that? What's the history?
If you think of the way the internet was initially kind of architected, it started off as a network built around the defense industry and educational institutions. And there were 2 points really where that network connected. It was May East and May West. May East was in Northern Virginia. You had the military complex there, and DARPA, which was the precursor to what we know as the internet, was really started there. And then you had another connection point where networks would shake hands around Silicon Valley. And what happened in those 2 regions was Northern Virginia, you had a lot of land, you had a very friendly utility in Dominion Energy. So you had cheap and plentiful land and cheap and plentiful power. And then ultimately, what you had was, once someone built a data center to be near May East, if someone wanted to connect to that, they would just build a data center near it. And you started having this kind of cluster of data centers. Now, other markets had that happen globally, where you either had networks come together or there was cheap available land and power. You would point to Silicon Valley being one, Chicago, Dallas here in the States, Frankfurt, Germany is a big one, London is a big one, Singapore historically was one, Hong Kong as well. And where you had big quantities of network that basically shook hands, that really becomes the fabric that makes the internet. So you're basically sharing traffic across these networks. People put infrastructure in those markets, and then you had this kind of force of gravity around these markets as the networks were handshaking in major metropolitan areas. What then kind of turns it from kind of a natural place for networks to shake hands to a hypergrowth area that, again, are those key ingredients of cheap and abundant land and cheap and abundant power. And you put those together, and that's the reason Northern Virginia as a data center market is substantially larger than that of Silicon Valley, because power's cheaper and land's more available.
What are some, you just mentioned the ingredients necessary to create data center hubs. What are you seeing other governments do as far as incentives or trying to build out the opportunity for their countries to become, I guess, hubs of digital infrastructure?
Well, so it's an interesting question, but the first question is, which countries are interested in that? Because I think if you roll the camera back 15 years ago, when people were talking about putting internet infrastructure in place, most folks thought that was a strategic asset they wanted to control as a government or as a country, that it would be to your strategic advantage not to be dependent on another country for basically the fabric of your internet. A lot of countries kind of ran after that. Roll the camera forward to the world of AI and the amount of power that's consumed by these chipsets and these data centers. All of a sudden, you've got this kind of push-pull inside governments, which are, hey, we really want our data to, basically want data sovereignty. We want our key data to stay inside our country. But oh my gosh, these data centers chew up a ton of power. How are we going to power these? So there's a push-pull inside these countries and inside different economic regions and zones. I think if you look at what countries right now are seeing a lot of data center growth, again, you go back to power and available land. And then the next piece is really having kind of the fabric of internet connectivity there. So there are actually networks there that want to connect to other networks. And then lastly, the old kind of gotcha on any international investing, which is, or the rule of law on property rights. So to put a big data center in the ground, you're talking a, $1 billion asset in terms of once it's built out, it could be anywhere between $5 to $12 billion for a large AI data center. You want to make sure that you're actually going to own that too.
Glad you mentioned the rule of law. You are, you know a lot about right-of-way corridors. I guess we're talking largely back in the States. Right-of-way corridors for digital assets. What is that and how do you get them?
So we're going down a deep rabbit hole here. So if you think about how one would build a network connecting Chicago to New York, and you've got, basically you need to be able to draw a straight line between those two cities and have it connected. Now to do that, you're not going to let someone just dig through your backyard. Or if someone wanted to dig through your backyard, they would have to pay you for that right. And so what you need is a right of way, i.e. a way to get from point A to point B, and think about it as like contiguous land corridors. So in the United States, we have a few holders of contiguous land corridors that have been granted either by the government or traditionally been granted by the government, and some people own those by kind of historical precedent. The ones you would look to would be the highway system, railroads, or power corridors. Another would be corridors that have been allowed for pipelines. Now, pipelines may occupy some of those other corridors as well, i.e. along rail lines, or they may have their own rights of way. But those rights of way and the ability to connect point A to point B are critical to build networks. And so that's why if you go back to when the internet was built, or even the early telecommunications networks were built, they utilized these corridors, primarily the railroads, because you weren't dealing with multiple jurisdictions. You had one railroad that controlled from New York to Chicago, or from, basically LA to Phoenix. That was historically controlled by one railroad. Again, if you think you're trying to build a network from, let's just say, San Francisco to Los Angeles, running north-south, you would rather either go down the interstate system, deal with one party, or go down the railroad corridor, then try to contract with probably 50,000 different landowners and have to strike an economic agreement with each one of those in constructing that network.
You mentioned, there being countries around the world that see the development of, an internet infrastructure as being part of the national interest. Can you tell us what's going on across Asia, where there's been sort of a real boom in data center construction, data center development, I believe in many cases backed by the government? What is happening in Asia, and what do you predict over the next 10 years or so?
So when you think of Asia, I tend to think of it in kind of different buckets. So Japan is one market, South Korea is another, or North Asia, China, completely different kettle of fish, and then you have Southeastern Asia, running off to the south and east of China. And so when you look at what's happening in Japan in terms of internet infrastructure, they were very early adopters of fiber optic technology, data centers, ultimately the fabric that makes the internet work. And so that was a pretty established ecosystem in Japan. And then so when cloud computing really got to be a thing in the 2007s, 2008s timeframe, you already had an ecosystem there. The Japanese have been, very aggressive deployers of that infrastructure. So they've used that compute utility. So that market, I would say, kind of operates in its own ecosystem and is well established. You then look at China, and that is going to be controlled by Chinese companies, period, full stop. Western companies will be allowed in there by invitation, potentially. The chance of them really owning and controlling infrastructure, very limited. And the Chinese government is going to control all those assets. So but at the same time, they are building out massive cloud deployments, massive fiber deployments. So AI, cloud computing, that's happening in a big time in China, but it really by Chinese companies. There's not really kind of a Western play there. If you then look at Southeast Asia as a different market, Singapore historically was, and the government going back to the 70s made a strategic decision. They wanted to be a hub of communications networks in the region. All networks basically go through Singapore, through that region. And if you think about it, almost what we would call as a trombone network in the fiber world, where if you're trying to send traffic from the Philippines to Indonesia, generally it's going Philippines into Singapore, out to Indonesia. And Singapore had really a strong hub market there. Rule of law was very clear, easy to do business with in terms of a regulatory environment, a very open regulatory environment that was similar to that of Australia, the US, or Western Europe. And so you had a number of different carriers there, a bunch of different infrastructure put in place. And ultimately, the data center ecosystem really exploded there. Ultimately, it grew so much that in 2018 or 2019, the Singapore government basically called timeout and said no more data centers for a certain number of years because, one, the buildings were eating up too much real estate in a very space-confined country, and two, they were pulling down too much power. At the same time, basically, if you think about that, so they basically locked down the data center environment. The dynamic of all these video calls, all this data going everywhere explodes. It goes exponential. And so you had a bunch of different companies looking for where they could put infrastructure to serve those markets, like the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. And so you ended up seeing small deployments of data centers in these markets. And then the question is where we're going to find the power, where we're going to find the fiber. And that is a story that's evolving right now. But I can tell you definitively the amount of money that is being spent in an area that has historically been underspent is really increasing. And you're seeing a number of different types of companies, be it from US hyperscalers going there, also the Chinese in a place like Indonesia, because they're open to both, really spheres of influence. And so you're seeing a number of companies go in there and put significant infrastructure in places where they do have land, they do have power, and people are getting increasingly comfortable with the rule of law in those geographies.
Is there a case to be made in a place like Indonesia or Malaysia where there's a lot of investment taking place, a case to be made that the presence of data centers and digital infrastructure benefits the economy because there's a bit of a tech transfer, there's learning, these places are staffed with locals, they take that knowledge and create more jobs? Is there sort of like a virtuous dynamic at play, or is that not the main reason why one would want data centers in their country?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons you would want data centers. One, again, when you get back to data sovereignty, some countries are very particular making sure their data stays inside, the country. And you think about either defense or intelligence information, people are generally pretty hesitant to let that traverse borders. And so controlling that infrastructure and then analyzing, using that information, that absolutely is a boost to the local economy. I think the other thing that data centers bring is really boost to the tax base, like significant boost to the tax base. As you see these deployments near population centers, and this gets a little bit more into AI, where the training models are basically developed and where the inference models live. You will find the inference models, closer to population centers where people can use those. The training models will tend to be, again, back where you've got cheap power, cheap land, and you've got more control and certainty over those models in terms of governmental intervention. The bull case on why you would want data centers would be you're doing work in local language with local data, and you're building up that ecosystem. You're also increasing the tax base substantially. The bear case on data centers in a given geography is once one of these massive data centers that is pulling down, hundreds of megawatts of power is stood up and running, you don't need a ton of people there. I mean, they're automated systems. It's not like you've just dropped a car factory in a place and you're going to, employ, tens of thousands of people. Now, there will be jobs on the construction side, there are jobs on the maintenance side, but they aren't huge hubs of employment. Really what happens then is the knowledge workers around that, and that leads you to kind of a conversation around, to a certain degree, the training and the inference models of AI.
Let's touch briefly on AI. I know everyone's talking about artificial intelligence and how it's driving demand for data centers, but I'd love your take on it. We've seen estimates that, if there's, 10,000 data centers in the world right now, the world actually needs 30,000. I don't know what numbers you follow most carefully, but do you think that's in the right ballpark? What scope of work is needed to get the physical infrastructure that powers the internet where it needs to be given expected demand?
Let's dive into your last two words of that question, which are expected demand. So AI as a technology will be transformative in my view. So, effectively, if you look at the deployment of electrical infrastructure in the early part of the 1900s globally, what you basically automated were a bunch of manual jobs. People were doing things by hand and using electrical power to automate those tasks. And you saw a massive rise in productivity, but it wasn't like all of a sudden you had a light bulb in your house and then you kind of harness that productivity. That was a multi-decade run where that infrastructure was put in place, and then people found ways to use it, ways to automate tasks. I think our species will go on a similar path with AI, which is you are going to automate a bunch of mental tasks that, we are just seeing the tip of how that's going to work. In our practice at Columbia, we look across digital infrastructure and then ways large enterprises use technology and ride trends in both of those. There is certainly a huge amount of capacity coming online for AI right now. You've seen it reflected in the amount of, going down to the chip level with NVIDIA, the poster child. People are buying a ton of these chips, putting them in servers, putting them in data centers, powering those up, et cetera, preparing the world for, these really the learning models around AI. Now, how enterprises will use that and how we use that technology in our everyday life, this is going to be a journey we're all going to go on. And the question of, will supply and demand be perfectly matched? I think in the deployment of any technology that's happened in my lifetime, there's always been that classic hype cycle. And then how quickly does that capacity get used? And then people figure out applications to ride on that infrastructure. I think it'll be an interesting 2 or 3 years to see what happens with AI. I can tell you the investment is absolutely being made. People are very bullish on the demand for AI. What I'm waiting to see is in large instances, and who spends a lot of money on technology? It's large businesses. And where do large businesses really start deploying and leaning into AI? I think they're just beginning to have those conversations. So I think we'll be going on a multi-year journey. Yes, we're going to need 2 to 3 times the amount of data centers we have. To me, the question is over what time scale?
I'd love for you to roll back the camera to the early 2000s to the build out of fiber optic capacity in the US, because the next question after that is going to be about, is there a risk that we're overbuilding, or is there a risk that certain parts of the digital infrastructure today are going to be obsolete before people know it? But before you make any analogies, maybe you can just tell us the story of how there was a crash in the early 2000s around telecom and fiber optic capacity. How did that come to be, and what was the aftermath?
It really all starts, and if you really want to roll the camera back to when MCI rolled out the long distance networks using microwave to connect hops, and they were competing against AT&T, which was a monopoly. They then pushed a case in federal court. A judge by the name of Judge Green broke up the AT&T monopoly. And then in 1996, after the monopoly was broken up, the FCC basically forced the local bell companies, because at that point you had AT&T, which was a long distance network, and then you had the local bell companies. They made the local bell companies open up their networks for competition, i.e. people could use parts of their network, they could lease them out. It prohibited certain anti-competitive behaviors by those local monopolies. And what you saw was an explosion of new businesses that were basically competing against, very fat, dumb, and happy monopolies. That happened at the same time that the internet became a thing. If you think about, kind of the dawn of people going online, it was probably like America Online. People were using their phone lines to dial up. Those were hitting modem banks. Then all of a sudden, that happened right as the regulations kind of unleashed competition, and you saw a huge spike in demand. So all of a sudden, networks that were built to carry voice traffic were having a real hard time and struggling to load pictures on your computer. And so there was a massive demand for telecommunications infrastructure. A number of companies were founded to take advantage of that demand. And you had also at the same time, you had the internet bubble happen. So you had a huge amount of capital flood into the public markets. So you roll the camera forward to 2000, and the first prick of the bubble was the dot-com crash. All of a sudden, people thought, wait a second, these businesses that we thought were worth billions of dollars, maybe it will take them longer to get there. So you had the dot-com crash. A lot of those business models proved to be unsustainable. Then you roll down to the infrastructure layer, and the communications providers who were the suppliers for the dot-com companies, all of a sudden, their stocks came under huge pressure. And I think there were 36 public competitive companies at that time. 35 of them went bankrupt. And at the last little bit before the bubble burst, the public markets were rewarding people just for spending money. So for every dollar you put in the ground of CapEx, you would get 3 times market cap value for that. So the incentive was to spend as much money as possible. People did it with borrowed money. Internet crash happened, and then it was horrific.
A lot of private equity firms lost a lot of money in that era, I recall.
A lot of private equity firms lost a lot of money. And that loss of money actually cost a lot of private equity firms the right to continue investing.
Their investors declined to re-up on their next investment vehicles.
Correct.
Fast forwarding to the present, and I know that the story of fiber optic and sort of the original .com boom is different than the story of the build out of digital infrastructure in anticipation of AI. But where do you see risks of overbuilding, and where do you see risks of technical obsolescence in the data center and digital infrastructure industry?
When we talk about digital infrastructure, I think it's, especially around the data center ecosystem, it's important to delineate the difference between cloud and AI. So when you think of cloud, and what I would, when you think about that, that would be the Oracle Cloud, Microsoft Azure, AWS. That effectively is compute as a utility. Again, I go back to an early part of our conversation. You think about the number of devices that are now connected to the internet, the amount of information that's getting pumped out by those. For that information to be stored, analyzed, and to be of any benefit to anyone, you actually need these giant repositories of data. That really has become, AWS, Azure, Oracle, Google Cloud. All of those have become those receptacles of that information. And you've also had a massive transition of workloads that were sitting on bespoke infrastructure running large enterprise applications. SAP for example, all the data that's sitting inside those systems that helps a company figure out, hey, we've got an order coming in, we need to ship this out here, what's our inventory level, et cetera. All that information needs to transition and is transitioning to cloud infrastructure. That is a massive trend, a massive wave, and the amount of money that has been spent and the profitability of those business models is substantial. You're still, not halfway through that data migration and frankly, ramping up the information and analysis of all the information coming off those sensors. So I think of that as cloud. Cloud continues to grow and has been really kind of the driver of the data center ecosystem for the past 15 years, without a doubt. You then pivot towards AI, which is a different, in some cases, different types of chipsets and different algorithms, basically optimizing these big pools of data. So AI still needs the cloud. It still needs those big repositories of data. And what you're looking at are basically servers jammed with chips that are looking at unstructured data and learning from that. And then hopefully with some type of productive commercial output from that, basically rules and different behaviors that can be put forth from that. The training models are in place now, and people are beginning to think about how that works. That's AI. You then push out, here are the rule sets associated with that. Those are the inference models that then get pushed out more regionally. So as you think about AI, different than cloud, what are the commercial applications for that right now? And people are just beginning to play around with that and really understand it. I think, again, I'm a huge bull on AI, but I would say I'm a qualified bull, which is I'm a bull, but I can't tell you the timeline. And there's a good friend of mine who's a much smarter investor than I am, has something he always tells me, which is sometimes being early is the same thing as being wrong. And you are seeing massive spending on the AI side, and it's going to happen, and it is going to be transformative. I just can't put my finger on it and tell you this is where it's going to happen. And this is the killer app, the way that video really was a killer app for bandwidth.
As you look across all the component parts of digital infrastructure, do you see any particular forms of technology that you think are most susceptible to becoming obsolete? Is it certain kinds of chips? Is it a certain model of data center? If you can use a little bit of a crystal ball.
I am not smart enough to answer that. The question is there a left field kind of application like quantum that comes out? And when I say application, that's really not an application, it's underlying technology. Does something like quantum computer go and just kind of really kind of overturn the paradigm of, compute, store, analyze that has evolved over the past 15 years? I am not smart enough to tell you if that's going to happen or when that's going to happen, but it would take something out of left field like that to make that happen. What we are not seeing is infrastructure being turned down. So basically turned down or turned over. You're just seeing additional layers being put on top of it. And so it's kind of like when you power down a power plant, you better have a lot of power coming online or already online if you're going to do that. And we haven't gotten to a point where demand is stable enough for compute as a utility for people to start powering down big workloads.
Pretty big question, and maybe you can give us a short answer. But you mentioned earlier about countries seeing digital infrastructure as being part of national security or part of the national interest. What would competition among nations look like in the digital infrastructure data center space? Could it turn nasty? What are some potential conflicts that might arise as different nations sort of jockey for position in the digital infrastructure space?
Again, shades of gray here. So there's jockeying for position, and then there's conflict. So around the Olympics, there have been certain forms of protest to disrupt the event. One of those protests manifested itself into multiple fiber cuts of the network that took a number of network providers down in France. That would be an example of something that could happen. You take that again on the conflict side, the amount of data and information that is carried on cables at the bottom of the ocean and the increasing amount of information that is very vulnerable and really tough to repair once something happens there. So, in a conflict case, there is absolutely a scenario where those are, massive, 10,000 mile long Achilles heels connecting allies. And that's a concern. It's a big concern. On probably the more benign side of the spectrum, as you think about, jockeying for position and realizing that digital infrastructure is something you want to have inside your borders, I think you will see power availability, rules around zoning, rules around rights of way that we've talked about, and rules around competition tilt to be more favorable for digital infrastructure. Because if you are putting up barriers, i.e. monopolies, barriers to competition, the capital and the workloads will just go somewhere else.
Well, I tried to get you to explain a number of sort of bad scenarios that could take place as digital infrastructure unfolds and that perhaps investors should lose sleep over. And yet you remain a bull. You said it yourself. Maybe we can close with a question, which is,
I'm a qualified bull.
Qualified bull.
Qualified bull.
You know what's going to happen. You just don't know exactly when.
I'm going to be right. It's just a question of which decade, right?
The optimist is always right in the long term, right?
Yeah.
Good things will eventually happen. So if you could summarize, what makes you excited to be an investor in the data center digital infrastructure space? What continues to make you excited as you look at the opportunity ahead?
There are very few times in human history where deployment of a specific technology happens at such a rapid, global, and transformative scale. So, kind of at a rapid, the drumbeat of what's happening right now is unlike anything we've seen since the deployment of the electrical grid. The impact it's having on people in terms of just this conversation, this would have been impossible to do 10 years ago at this quality, at this fidelity, and now we just take it for granted. And what that technology allows is just transformational to us as a species. I've got the opportunity to sit here on the front row and watch it happen across a number of geographies. And, I'm a student of history. I just think it's stimulating and feels historic. So I think it's a great time to do what I do, and I like doing it. And, you're actually building something. I can actually go and point to the assets that are getting put in the ground or the building that's getting built and say, basically, this is going to enable telemedicine. This will enable distance learning. Now, it also enables a lot of bad stuff too, to be clear, but it's changing the way our species relates to itself really. And I just think that's, it sounds dorky, but super cool to be there on the front row watching it happen.
Well, John Siegel from Columbia Capital, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us. It is indeed exciting to hear from you, who has a front row seat at the build out of digital infrastructure all over the world. So thanks so much for talking to Cool Vector today.
Thank you. Really appreciate the conversation, and thanks for having me on.